The front line did not just bend, it shattered. By May 1940, the German advance had carved through the Ardennes with a speed that defied every map and every plan. Thousands of men, caught in the wake of the armored surge, scrambled westward in a desperate, disorganized tide. They pushed through the dust and the debris, driven by the roar of engines that never seemed to fall behind. Then, the land simply ended. They reached the port of Dunkirk, expecting a gateway to safety, but found only a wall of cold, grey water. The English Channel stretched out, indifferent and vast. Behind them, the rumble of the panzer divisions grew louder, sealing the final exit. The men stopped. They stood on the dunes, looking back at the smoke rising from the horizon, then out at the sea. There was no road left to take. The realization moved through the ranks like a physical weight. They were pinned. The water lapped at the sand, rhythmic and hollow. A soldier dropped his pack, his fingers trembling as he stared at the empty horizon. The trap had closed. The silence of the beach was heavier than the roar of the guns. The sky turned black before the sound arrived. Then came the high-pitched scream of Stuka dive bombers, a mechanical shriek that tore through the air. Men dived into the dunes, clawing at the sand to hollow out shallow foxholes. The ground buckled as bombs struck the shoreline, throwing plumes of grit and debris into the air. The smell of cordite and burning oil choked the beach, thick enough to taste. Every explosion sent shrapnel whistling through the air, forcing the men to press their faces into the cold sand. They waited for the roar to subside, but it only shifted, moving up and down the line of soldiers. When the planes finally banked away, the silence that followed was worse. It was a hollow, ringing quiet. A soldier gripped his rifle, his knuckles white against the wood, and scanned the gray expanse of the channel. He looked for the silhouette of a ship, a mast, anything to break the horizon, but the sea remained empty. He turned to his comrade, his voice barely a rasp against the wind. "They will never get us out of here." The words hung in the air, uncontradicted. The horizon offered no relief, only the steady, rhythmic movement of the tide against the sand. They were trapped in a killing field, waiting for a rescue that felt like a ghost story. In the sterile, map-covered rooms of the Admiralty, the reports arrived in a steady, grim stream. Officers traced the coastline with steady hands, but their eyes betrayed the mounting tension. The news from the coast was absolute. The army was pinned, and the Luftwaffe held the skies. A senior commander leaned over the charts, his finger tapping the shallow, sand-choked waters off the Dunkirk port. The Royal Navy's destroyers drew too much water. They could not get close enough to reach the waiting thousands. A heavy silence settled over the room as the reality took hold. The standard tools of war were useless here. The commander turned away from the maps, his voice low and sharp. "If the destroyers cannot reach them, we must find something that can." Operation Dynamo was born. The government broadcast the plea, a signal sent into the dark, hoping for a miracle. The call echoed through the harbors of Ramsgate and Dover, cutting through the morning mist. It was an invitation to cross the channel, a request for anyone with a hull and a motor to join the rescue. Along the docks, the transformation was immediate. Fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, and lifeboats began to congregate, a mismatched armada born of necessity. Men moved with purposeful haste, loading supplies and checking fuel lines. A boat owner wiped grease from his hands, his gaze fixed on the gray, churning water beyond the harbor wall. He tightened a bolt on the engine casing, the metal cold and slick under his fingers. Beside him, a weekend cruiser bobbed in the swell, its white paint stark against the dark, oily harbor water. There was no military precision here, only the steady rhythm of preparation. Men who had spent their lives navigating coastal currents now checked their charts for a different kind of journey. They knew the risks. They knew the destination was a furnace. Yet, as the tide turned, the engines sputtered to life, one by one. A low, uneven rumble filled the air, a collective defiance against the encroaching silence of the war. The English Channel offered no mercy. The small vessels pitched violently, their wooden hulls groaning against the relentless, cold swells. Ahead, the water turned treacherous. Floating mines bobbed like dark, lethal buoys in the troughs of the waves. Skippers stood at their helms, eyes scanning the surface, hands white-knuckled on the wheel as they wove a path through the unseen death. Then, the sky changed. A high-pitched, mechanical shriek tore through the clouds. Stuka dive bombers plummeted, their silhouettes growing rapidly against the gray expanse. Explosions erupted in the water, sending plumes of spray and oil skyward, rocking the small boats with the force of the concussions. One yacht swerved, its propeller churning the foam as the skipper fought to keep his heading amidst the cascading water. There was no turning back. As the smoke cleared, The horizon ahead revealed the truth of the coast. A thick black shroud of burning oil and cordite hung over the port, turning day into a bruised, unnatural twilight. The civilian skippers saw the graveyard of sunken steel blocking the harbor entrance. They did not slow. They steered their small, fragile craft directly into the heart of the inferno. The water near the shoreline was a slurry of sand and oil. A fishing trawler cut its engine, drifting into the shallows as soldiers waded out, their hands raised. The boat owner reached over the gunwale, grabbing a soldier by the webbing of his gear. He hauled the man up, the weight of his sodden boots dragging against the hull. A whistle tore through the air, followed by a thunderous impact on the beach that sent a spray of sand and shrapnel whistling across the deck. The boat owner did not flinch. He shoved the shivering man toward the stern and reached for the next. It was a brutal, rhythmic labor. Every successful transfer was a silent victory against the encroaching tide of death. The small boats acted as a bridge, ferrying men from the surf to the larger destroyers anchored in the deep. Each trip back to the beach was a gamble against the Luftwaffe. A bomb detonated 50 yards off the port beam, the shockwave nearly capsizing the vessel. The boat owner corrected the helm, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the splintered wood of the wheel. He looked back at the beach, where the queues remained, and turned the bow back into the surf. There was no time for fear, only the next man, the next reach, and the next pull from the freezing water. The Luftwaffe intensified their assault, dropping tons of high explosives onto the dunes. The beach transformed into a landscape of craters and flying shrapnel. A heavy bomb detonated just meters from a waiting line, throwing sand and debris into the air. The soldiers standing there were knocked off balance, but as the smoke cleared, they stood up, dusted off their shoulders, and stepped forward to fill the gap. The queue did not break. It did not even waver. Hour after hour, the discipline held against the relentless pressure of the fire. Every man knew his place in the order, and every man maintained it. The shuttle of the little ships continued, a constant churning movement between the sand and the deep water vessels. As the ninth day dawned, the final boat pulled away from the surf, its deck packed to capacity. The tally was confirmed. 338,000 men had been lifted from the jaws of the trap. The beach was empty, save for the abandoned gear and the silent, shifting sand. The impossible had been achieved. The line had held until the very last man was clear, turning a total collapse into a survival that defied the odds of war. The first ships arrived at Dover under a pale, overcast sky. Soldiers stepped off the decks, their boots hitting the wooden piers with a hollow, rhythmic thud. They did not march. They moved with the heavy, uncoordinated gait of men who had lived through the impossible. On the docks, the silence was profound. There were no cheers, only the steady sound of feet and the soft sobbing of those finally letting go of the tension. They were not returning as conquerors, but as survivors of a catastrophe that had nearly erased them. The news of their arrival spread through the streets of London, bringing a wave of relief that washed over the nation. Inside the halls of Parliament, the air was thick with the gravity of the moment. Winston Churchill stepped to the podium, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the assembly. He did not speak of defeat. He spoke of the iron will of a people who refused to break. His voice resonated through the chamber, turning the retreat into a defiant cry. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared, his words hardening into a promise. The retreat was over, but the war had only just begun. The soldiers who stood in the shadows of the gallery listened, their faces set with a new, cold determination. The channel grew calm as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the water. The frantic churn of propellers and the roar of engines faded into the past, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt heavy. Where once the air had been torn by the scream of dive bombers and the thunder of artillery, now only the rhythmic pulse of the tide remained. The sea washed over the abandoned stretches of sand, smoothing away the foxholes and the footprints of thousands. It was as if the water itself were trying to erase the scars of the last 9 days. Yet, the memory of the little ships endured. They were not warships, nor were they built for the brutality of combat. Yet, they had navigated the mine-strewn currents to bring brothers home. This moment of quiet was a testament to the resilience of ordinary people. When the world seemed to collapse, they chose to sail directly into the fire. The evacuation was over, but the spirit forged in those dark hours remained. It was a promise written in the stillness of the evening, a quiet resolve that would outlast the smoke and the wreckage. The war was far from won, but the retreat had ended. The sea fell silent, holding the memory of a miracle that had transformed a desperate escape into the foundation of a future victory.